So let's think more about how wine is produced and why is the alcohol content of wine usually somewhere between 10 and 15%. So if we think about this, we know that wine is produced from grape juice, and grape juice has some percentage of sugar in it, and we can find out how much that is. We can look at a label of Welch's grape juice, and we can see that there's approximately 20 to 30%. And so if we want to calculate how much ethanol we would get from this, we can do this very simple calculation. And so here is the balanced reaction of glucose turning to ethanol and carbon dioxide. And if we balance the reaction, we see that 1 mole of glucose is going to turn into 2 moles of ethanol. If we assume that grape juice has about 20% of glucose in it, and we assume that we start out with as much grape juice as we finally end up with in volume in wine, we can then figure out what the final alcohol concentration would be according to this formula. If we then assume that 20% of the volume is glucose, then we end up with 150 grams of glucose total. And if we convert this to moles, that's 0.8 moles of glucose, which, since there's a 1:2 ratio between the glucose and the ethanol, there will be 1.6 moles of ethanol. And so if we convert this will then correspond to 73 grams of ethanol. And if we know what the density is of ethanol, we can find out that that's approximately 104 milliliters. And this in turn corresponds to 13.8% of ethanol in this case. So in the previous calculation, we're assuming that all of the glucose in the grape juice is converted to ethanol. And so this is why a typical red wine is not particularly sweet, because it's all been converted to ethanol. But what if you wanted a sweet wine? Or what, for a matter of fact, if you wanted a wine with a higher ethanol content? What would you do? Well, one thing to do is you could simply go through have the reaction happen, and then you would just add some sugar at the end, and you could either stop it there and have a sweet wine, or you could have the fermentation continue and the microbes would make more ethanol and you would have a higher ethanol content. And there are different ways around the world that people have tried playing with this. And one way is to simply use sweeter grapes. And there are a number of different ways that you can obtain sweeter grapes. One of them is to just let them sit and dry on the vine and let the sugar content increase. Another way is to wait until it gets cold outside and the sugar content also increases. And that's what's used for ice vines in Germany, for example. And yet another way is to inoculate the grapes with a fungus, and this is called noble rot wines. And there the sugar content also increases, and this is how you make Tokais in Hungary or Sauternes in France. If you now do this, you're increasing the sugar content and you're making a sweeter wine. Or if the fermentation continues to happen, you're making a wine with a higher alcohol content. So why can't you just increase the alcohol content indefinitely? Well, the reason for that is that alcohol is basically a poison to the yeast that are making the ethanol in the first place. And so after a certain percentage of alcohol, they start being very unhappy and eventually they die. And this happens somewhere in the range of 17 to 20%, and it depends on what kind of microbe you're using for this. That means that you can not make a wine that has an alcohol content that is higher than 20% naturally. And so if you wanted to do that, you would actually have to distill the wine or have some other way of adding alcohol to it.